What if one careless tap sent a single vibrant photo crashing into the loneliest, most guarded life on Earth, and instead of deleting it, he answered, forever changing both their worlds? The sun balanced on the edge of Lahore's crowded skyline like a perfect copper coin, spilling molten gold across the cracked brick wall where Ilara Voss had spent the last 3 days painting. She stepped back, boots crunching on broken glass and dried leaves, and studied the mural one final time before the light changed. A riot of color exploded across the surface, swirling flames of orange and magenta bleeding into deep indigo, abstract human figures stretching upward as though trying to grasp the disappearing sun itself. It wasn't pretty in the conventional sense, too jagged, too angry, too alive, but it felt true. And that was all Ilara had ever asked her work to be. She lifted her phone, an old model with a cracked screen protector she could never afford to replace, framed the shot so the last rays caught the wet paint just right, and pressed the shutter. The image glowed on her display, vivid and breathing, exactly the way she wanted to remember this piece before the city's night swallowed it whole. Her thumb hovered over the send icon. The group chat with the other street artists, 5 names she had known since the early spray paint nights, was already open. She typed a quick caption, "Golden hour didn't disappoint. Thoughts?" Then, distracted by the sudden blare of a passing rickshaw horn and the ache in her painting arm, she hit send without double-checking the recipient list. 1 digit. A single careless digit transposed from an old client contact she had saved months ago for a small cafe commission that never paid. The photo vanished from her outbox and rocketed through encrypted channels she didn't even know existed, landing silently in an inbox guarded by military-grade firewalls. 40 kilometers away, on the top floor of a mirrored tower that overlooked the Ravi River like a cold, unblinking eye, Arthur Hale sat motionless in a room designed for efficiency rather than comfort. White marble underfoot reflected the blue glow of 6 curved monitors arranged in a semicircle around his chair. No photographs adorned the walls, no plants softened the edges. The only sound was the low, constant hum of cooling fans and the occasional soft chime of incoming market data. He had not left this building for anything resembling pleasure in 18 months, not since the private memorial service for his younger sister, the only person who had ever shortened his name to Artie and lived to tease him about it. The rest of the world called him Mr. Hale or Sir or simply the chairman, depending on how much they wanted from him that day. A single notification pinged on the private server he reserved for emergencies and the handful of people who had clearance to reach him after midnight. He assumed it was a delayed security alert or perhaps one of his lieutenants forwarding another acquisition proposal disguised as urgent. He opened the message without expectation. The screen filled with color so sudden and violent it felt like a physical intrusion. A mural, street art, paint still wet under golden light, figures reaching, flames curling, chaos held together by nothing more than audacity and pigment. Arthur stared. Seconds stretched into a full minute. He had spent years surrounding himself with monochrome palettes, black suits, gray steel, white noise, because color reminded him too sharply of things he had buried. Yet here it was, uninvited and unapologetic, burning straight through the sterile perfection of his evening. He leaned closer. The resolution was startlingly high for a phone snapshot. Every brushstroke and drip was visible. Something about the composition irritated him on a technical level. The lower third felt overcrowded, the balance precarious. But beneath the critique stirred something else. Curiosity, a flicker of warmth he had long trained himself to ignore. Almost without conscious decision, his fingers moved across the keyboard. Lighting is flat. 3 words. Curt, dismissive. The kind of reply he used to use to discourage unsolicited messages from strangers who somehow found a way past his filters. He hit send and returned to the scrolling numbers on the center monitor, expecting silence in return. He was wrong. The city outside continued its restless pulse, rickshaws weaving through traffic, street vendors calling out, muezzins preparing for the next prayer. But inside 2 very different rooms, something invisible had already begun to shift. A single misdirected photograph carrying the last light of a dying day had crossed the chasm between chaos and control, between color and gray, between a muralist who painted because she had to, and a billionaire who had forgotten why he once wanted to feel anything at all. And neither of them yet understood how completely it would change everything. Arthur Hale's reply hung in the ether for less than 90 seconds before his private inbox chimed again. He had already dismissed the window, convinced the intruder would fade back into the noise of the night, but the new message forced itself onto his central screen with insistent brightness. He opened it almost against his will. "Flat? It's golden hour, you Philistine. The sun doesn't pose for your approval. If you think you can do better, come paint it yourself." The words landed like a thrown gauntlet. No deference, no emojis to soften the edge, no careful phrasing designed to flatter or extract favor, just raw, unfiltered challenge wrapped in casual insult. Arthur felt his pulse tick upward, not with anger exactly, but with something sharper and more unfamiliar: surprise. In his world, people measured every syllable against potential gain or loss. Executives rehearsed conversations in mirrors. Board members softened criticism with layers of praise. Even his closest advisors spoke in calibrated tones that never quite reached honesty. Yet here was a stranger, presumably a woman from the confident, almost reckless cadence, who had read his three-word dismissal and decided not to retreat, but to strike back harder. He reread the message twice, the cursor blinking patiently beside it. Philistine. The word carried an old-fashioned sting, one he hadn't heard directed at him since university days, when classmates still dared to mock his relentless focus on numbers over nuance. Back then, he had worn the label like armor. Now it felt oddly refreshing, as though someone had cracked open a window in a room sealed for years. His fingers hovered above the keys. He could delete the thread, block the sender, and return to the predictable rhythm of quarterly projections and offshore accounts. Instead, curiosity, a dangerous, dormant curiosity, won. "The composition fights itself," he typed. "Too much chaos in the lower third. It pulls the eye away from the focal ascent." He sent it before he could overthink the decision. A small act of engagement, the first voluntary breach of his self-imposed isolation in longer than he cared to count. The response arrived faster this time, as though she had been waiting, paint-stained fingers already poised. "Chaos is the point. Life isn't neatly cropped or balanced for boardroom approval. The figures are reaching because they're desperate, not because they're posed. If you want symmetry, buy a stock chart. This is survival rendered in color." Arthur exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The reply wasn't defensive, it was a manifesto disguised as rebuttal. She hadn't apologized for the intrusion, hadn't begged forgiveness for the glitch that delivered her art to his inbox. Instead, she had doubled down, forcing him to confront the work on its own terms rather than his. He leaned back in the ergonomic chair that cost more than most people's annual rent and studied the original photo again. This time, he tried, really tried, to see past the technical flaws he had instinctively cataloged. The overcrowding in the lower register no longer looked like a mistake. It looked like pressure building, like gravity pulling against aspiration. The colors didn't clash so much as collide with purpose. For the first time in years, he felt the faint stir of something he used to call inspiration, before life taught him to distrust it. Outside his tower, Lahore thrummed with its usual restless energy, motorbikes weaving through narrow lanes, vendors shouting prices over sizzling grills, the call to Maghrib prayer rising in melodic waves. Inside Alara's cramped rooftop studio in Anarkali, she paced between half-finished canvases and drying brushes, her heart hangering from the audacity of her own words. She had no idea who had received the misfired photo, some anonymous critic perhaps, or worse, someone who could make trouble for unauthorized street art, but the cold precision of "lighting is flat" had ignited something defiant in her. She refused to shrink. If this stranger wanted to judge, she would make him see. Another notification. Arthur's reply this time carried a trace of hesitation she could almost feel through the screen. Why the reaching figures? What are they trying to escape? Ilara smiled despite herself, small, fierce, triumphant. The question wasn't criticism anymore, it was curiosity. She sat cross-legged on the paint-splattered floor, back against a stack of stretched canvases, and began to type. The conversation that had started as friction was already bending towards something neither of them could name. In one room, color had invaded gray silence. In the other, defiance had met silence and refused to yield. And somewhere in the space between those two worlds, a thread, thin, accidental, electric, had begun to pull them closer. The messages that had begun as sharp jabs softened into something quieter, more sustained, like the slow bleed of twilight into night. What started with critiques of composition and lighting soon stretched into longer threads that arrived after midnight and lingered until the first call to Fajr echoed across Lahore's rooftops. Ilara would finish a late painting session, wash the cadmium red from her hands under cold tap water, then sit on the threadbare rug in her Anakali studio and type until her phone battery warned her to stop. Arthur, still at his curved monitors in the glass tower above Gulberg, would pause the endless scroll of global indices, dim the overhead lights, and let the words pull him away from the cold arithmetic of wealth. Art became the safe entry point, discussions of brushwork, perspective, the ethics of public walls, but the conversations never stayed safe for long. They drifted into philosophy almost without noticing, whether beauty required pain, whether silence was a form of violence, whether anyone could ever truly see another person without first seeing what that person lacked. Ilara described her world in vivid, unfiltered detail. Her studio was chaos made physical, canvases leaning against every wall, jars of murky turpentine, half-eaten plates of dal and roti pushed to the side, plants drooping from too little light and too much hope. She wrote about the nights she painted until her shoulders locked, driven by the fear that if she stopped, the small town she had escaped would pull her back. "I grew up where dreams were a luxury tax nobody could pay," she typed once at 2:17 a.m. "My mother cleaned houses so I could buy one tube of titanium white. Every mural feels like paying her back." Arthur read those lines 3 times before replying. He had never known hunger in that way, but he recognized the mathematics of debt. Different currency, same equation. In return, he offered fragments he had never spoken aloud, not to therapists, not to the sister who once knew him best, not even to himself in the quiet hours. He admitted the penthouse felt less like a home and more like a vault designed to keep everything out, including him. "I stopped leaving the building for anything that wasn't scheduled 18 months ago," he wrote one night, when the city lights below looked like scattered coins he no longer needed. "The last time I walked without purpose was to bury her. After that, motion felt pointless." He didn't name his sister, too raw, but Ilara felt the weight of the omission. She didn't press. Instead, she sent a single line: "I'm sorry the world took your reason to move." No platitudes, no promises that time would heal, just acknowledgement, plain and steady. Those small confessions became the bridge. Ilara shared the night she painted her first mural on a government building wall at 3 in the morning, heart hammering because getting caught could mean jail or worse, yet she couldn't not do it. Arthur confessed that he sometimes stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows and watched the city breathe below him, wondering if anyone down there still remembered how to want something that money couldn't buy. They traded secrets the way people do when faces are hidden, freely, fiercely, without the usual armor. She told him about the scar on her left forearm from a police baton during a protest. He told her about the panic attack that hit him in a boardroom 3 years earlier, how he'd excused himself to the bathroom and sat on the marble floor until he could breathe again, terrified someone would see the invincible man unravel. Night after night the ritual held. Her studio smelled of linseed oil and wet earth from the potted tulsi she kept for luck. His penthouse carried the sterile scent of ionized air and expensive leather. Yet the distance between those spaces shrank with every message. The muralist who painted because silence felt like erasure, and the mogul who had built an empire to outrun grief, found in the small blue glow of their screens the first real company either had known in years. Neither called it friendship, yet, too fragile a word for something that felt more like oxygen after long suffocation, but the cracks were forming.
Thin lines of light breaking through the walls Arthur had spent a lifetime fortifying, and through the armor of defiance Ilara wore to keep the world at arm's length. The ivory tower wasn't crumbling, not yet, but it was no longer completely sealed.
The message arrived at 11:43 p.m. on a Thursday when the Lahore sky had turned the bruised purple of pre-monsoon heat. Ilara's fingers were still tacky with fresh ultramarine as she typed it, sitting on the edge of her narrow bed surrounded by drying sketches and the faint smell of burnt cumin from the neighbor's kitchen. There's an underground gallery opening next Friday in the old Haveli near Shahi Guzargah. No names, no cameras, no VIP lists. Everyone enters masked or hooded if they want. If you're real, if these nights mean anything beyond words on a screen, show up. 9 p.m., I'll be near the East Wall mural, the one with the broken-winged bird in cadmium yellow. Look for that. She hit send before doubt could claw it back, then immediately regretted the vulnerability in the last line. Too specific, too hopeful. She tossed the phone onto the pillow and stared at the cracked ceiling, wondering if silence would be worse than rejection. Arthur read the invitation 4 times in the dim glow of his penthouse. The city sprawled below like a living circuit board, indifferent to the tremor that started in his chest. He hadn't attended any public gathering, not a gala, not a launch, not even a family wedding since the media frenzy after his sister's funeral turned every glance into scrutiny. Security protocols had become his second skin. Advanced teams, closed routes, private elevators. The thought of stepping into a crowded room, face exposed to strangers who might recognize him, sent a cold current down his spine. Yet the alternative, letting the thread between them snap because he was too afraid to cross it, felt worse. He opened his calendar. Nothing scheduled for Friday night. He closed it again. Then, for the first time in years, he made a decision that had nothing to do with profit or power. Friday came wrapped in thick humidity. Arthur left the tower at 8:15 p.m. through the service entrance, dressed in plain black jeans, a charcoal hoodie pulled low over his brow, and a lightweight scarf he wound loosely around the lower half of his face. Not quite a mask, but enough to blur recognition in dim light. No driver, no detail, just a hired rideshare that dropped him 2 streets away so he could walk the last stretch unnoticed. The narrow gully smelled of frying pakoras and wet stone. Music pulsed faintly from behind high wooden doors studded with rusted iron. He slipped inside behind a group of laughing students, heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. The Haveli had been transformed. Fairy lights strung across crumbling arches, murals splashed over every available surface, raw, urgent, political, tender. Low tables held clay cups of chai, and mismatched speakers thumped with underground qawwali remixes. People moved in clusters, some masked, some barefaced, voices rising and falling in a dozen languages. Arthur kept to the edges, scanning for cadmium yellow. He found the mural almost by accident, a massive bird with one shattered wing, the other straining toward a fractured moon. The paint still looked wet in places, and standing beneath it, arms folded, head tilted as she listened to another artist's animated explanation, was Ilara. She wore a faded black kurta streaked with older paint, hair tied back with a scrap of cloth, small silver hoops glinting in the low light. No makeup, no pretense, just the woman whose words had kept him company through sleepless nights. Arthur stopped 10 paces away, suddenly unsure what came next. She must have felt the weight of his gaze because she turned, eyes sweeping the crowd and locked on him. Recognition hit them both at once, sharp and wordless. Her lips parted slightly. His scarf slipped an inch, revealing the line of his jaw. Neither moved for several heartbeats. Then Ilara walked towards him, steady, unhurried. She stopped close enough that he caught the faint scent of turpentine and jasmine oil clinging to her skin. "You came," she said, voice low beneath the music. A small, crooked smile tugged at her mouth. "Lighting still flat in person?" Arthur exhaled a sound that might have been a laugh if he hadn't forgotten how. "No," he said. "It's blinding, in the best way." He pulled the scarf down fully, letting her see his face, older than the voice on the screen perhaps, but unguarded for the first time in years. She studied him without flinching, then nodded once, as though confirming something she had already decided. They didn't speak again for a long moment. Around them the gallery pulsed with life, laughter, arguments over brush technique, the clink of cups, but the space between them felt separate, sacred. The risk had been taken. Screens were gone.
Distance was gone. Only presence remained, fragile and real and terrifyingly alive.
Alara's pulse thundered in her ears louder than the remixed kawali beating against the Haveli walls. She had spent the last week convincing herself the stranger on the other side of the screen might not show, that the late-night confessions were safe precisely because they stayed digital, weightless, contained. Yet here he was, taller than she'd pictured, shoulders broader beneath the plain charcoal hoodie, eyes darker and more searching than any message could convey. Arthur stood frozen for a heartbeat after lowering the scarf, as though bracing for judgment or retreat. The crowd swirled around them, artists arguing color theory, couples swaying to the music, someone dropping a clay cup that shattered like distant applause, but the space between them felt carved out of time, private and electric. She closed the last step slowly, deliberately, giving him room to pull back if the reality proved too much. Up close, he smelled faintly of clean rain on concrete and something warmer, like cedar from whatever expensive soap he used in that sterile penthouse she could only imagine. His face carried the faint lines of someone who had spent too many nights staring at screens instead of sleeping, yet there was no hardness in his expression now, only a raw, unguarded hope that made her chest ache. "You came," she repeated, softer this time, the words almost lost under the music. Her crooked smile returned, half teasing, half disbelieving. "I half expected a no-show, or a security team clearing the room before you stepped inside." Arthur let out a short, unsteady breath that might have been laughter if nerves hadn't tightened his throat. "I considered both," he admitted, "the second option more than once." He glanced around at the pulsing chaos of the gallery, the murals bleeding into one another on crumbling plaster, the strings of bare bulbs casting golden pools across paint-splattered floors, then back to her. "But I kept seeing your last message, the bird with the broken wing. I couldn't leave it unanswered." His gaze dropped briefly to the mural behind her, the cadmium yellow wings straining against gravity, the shattered one trailing fragments like falling stars. It felt personal. Alara followed his eyes, then looked back at him. It was, still is. She gestured vaguely toward the painting. "I finished it the night after our argument about whether suffering makes art honest. Kept thinking about what she said, how silence can be its own kind of violence. So I painted the violence of trying to fly anyway." She shrugged one shoulder, suddenly self-conscious under his steady attention. "Silly, maybe." "Not silly," his voice was low, almost reverent. "Necessary." He took half a step closer, the distance between them shrinking to something intimate, breath shared. "I've spent years building walls so high I forgot what air feels like outside them. You sent one photo and started dismantling them without even trying." The admission hung there, unguarded. Alara felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from the sudden certainty that every late-night message was real, that the man who once dismissed her work in 3 cold words was now standing in front of her, asking to be seen. She reached out without thinking, fingertips brushing the sleeve of his hoodie. The contact was small, fleeting, but it anchored them both. "Then let's stop hiding behind screens, at least for tonight." They drifted away from the east wall, finding a quieter corner near a half-collapsed joroka where moonlight spilled through carved marble lattice. The music faded to background throb as they talked, first haltingly, then with the same easy rhythm their messages had found. She told him about the rickshaw ride over, how she'd almost turned back twice because her hands wouldn't stop shaking. He confessed the panic that hit him in the alley outside, how he'd stood against a wall counting breaths until the fear receded enough to push through the door. They laughed, quiet, surprised laughs, at how ordinary those fears sounded out loud. Hours slipped past unnoticed. The crowd thinned, lights dimmed to amber. Someone started packing away speakers. Alara leaned against the cool stone, watching Arthur trace the edge of a nearby mural with his eyes, memorizing it the way he used to memorize balance sheets. "You're really here," she said again, almost to herself. He turned to her, expression soft in the low light. "I'm really here." Then quieter, "And I don't want to leave." Neither moved to end the night. They stayed until the last artist locked the doors behind them, stepping out into the pre-dawn hush of Lahore's old city. Streetlights flickered gold on wet cobblestones. A lone rooster crowed somewhere distant. Side by side, without touching yet without needing to, they walked slowly towards whatever came next. 2 people who had collided by glitch and chosen, against every probability, to stay collided. The first photograph appeared in an international art magazine 3 months after that humid Friday night in the Old Haveli. It showed Ilara Voss standing on scaffolding in front of a massive wall in Berlin, mid-stroke, cadmium orange dripping from her brush onto the sleeve of her paint-splattered kurta, while Arthur Hale, hoodie replaced by a simple black coat, held the latter steady below her. The caption read, "Street art meets silent power. The muralist and the mogul redefined patronage." Neither had posed for the shot. A passing photographer had caught the moment by chance, and the image spread like wildfire across galleries, social feeds, and boardroom screens. Whispers followed. The untouchable chairman of Hale Enterprises was now visible in daylight, laughing at something off frame, sleeves rolled up, a streak of yellow paint across one cheek. The elite circles that once courted him with calculated deference now watched in stunned silence as the man who had mastered distance allowed proximity, messy, colorful, human. Ilara's world expanded in ways she had only ever painted in dreams. Commissions arrived from cities she had once only seen in grainy online photos: Sao Paulo, Cape Town, Tokyo. Her murals, still raw, still defiant, began appearing on legal walls granted by municipalities eager to claim cultural relevance. Funding followed, quiet and steady, routed through foundations Arthur quietly established so no one could accuse her of being bought. She refused strings, he refused credit. They met in the middle. Her art gained the oxygen of global visibility. His resources became invisible scaffolding. She flew economy, painted through jet-lagged nights, and sent him blurry selfies from scaffolding at dawn with captions like, "Golden hour in Lisbon still isn't flat, Philistine." He replied with single-word acknowledgments that somehow carried more warmth than any press release ever could. Breathtaking. Arthur's transformation was quieter, but no less profound. Mornings that once began with pre-market data now started with coffee on the penthouse balcony, watching the Ravi River catch first light, while Ilara, still half asleep in one of his oversized shirts, leaned against the railing and sketched the skyline in charcoal. He left the tower from no reason other than to walk beside her through Anarkali's crowded bazaars, haggling for cheap brushes, eating spicy chaat from street carts until his lips burned. Board meetings grew shorter. He delegated more, attended fewer galas, and when he did appear, it was often with her hand tucked into the crook of his elbow, her presence a silent rebuttal to every assumption about power and isolation. Colleagues noticed the change in his eyes, less guarded, more alive, and some dared to call it happiness. He didn't correct them. They fought, of course. She accused him of retreating into silence when old fears resurfaced. He accused her of pushing too hard against boundaries he still needed. But the fights ended in paint-splattered apologies and late-night talks on rooftops, where Lahore's lights glittered below like scattered jewels. They learned each other's rhythms, her need for chaos to create, his need for quiet to process. She taught him to hold a spray can without overthinking the line. He taught her to read a balance sheet without panic. Together they built something neither had believed possible, a life that fused their separate worlds without erasing either. One evening, as monsoon rain hammered the penthouse windows, Ilara stood at the glass wall watching water streak the city into abstract strokes. Arthur came up behind her, arms loose around her waist, chin resting on her shoulder. "Do you ever think about that first photo, the glitch that started all this?" She leaned back into him. "Every day. I almost deleted it before sending. One tap the wrong way and none of this exists." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Then I'm grateful for clumsy thumbs." Outside, the rain softened to a steady patter. Inside, two people who had once lived behind screens and walls now shared the same air, the same light, the same uncertain, beautiful future. What began as an accidental signal, a vibrant image crashing into monochrome silence, had become proof that connection doesn't require perfect planning or shared status. It only requires the courage to answer when life misdials her number, and the stubbornness to keep answering until the call becomes home. The muralist and the mogul had painted a new perspective together, one where love isn't a transaction, but a shared canvas, imperfect, vibrant, and endlessly worth the risk.